What happens when a flight attendant demands a grieving man hide the one thing that's keeping him alive, without realizing that man is Liam Neeson? What began as a simple flight turned into a powerful confrontation that left an entire cabin in silence and changed one woman's life forever. Watch this story until the very end to understand why this necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was a lifeline. The hum of jet engines rumbled through the terminal as the final calls echoed over the PA system. Travelers moved with the usual urgency, wheeling briefcases and chasing gate numbers, like time itself was running out. Amid this orchestrated chaos, one man moved slower than the rest. Not out of confusion, but with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't need to rush. He wore a dark wool coat draped over a simple black shirt, a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. There was nothing flashy about him. No designer emblems, no entourage, no noise. But there was something else, an invisible gravity in the way he carried himself, as if every step was tethered to something deeper. Around his neck, barely visible beneath the collar of his shirt, a small silver cross swung gently with each step. It wasn't ornate or polished. In fact, it looked aged, faintly dulled, the edges softened with time. It was the kind of item that didn't beg for attention, but once noticed, was impossible to forget. It didn't look like a symbol of power or religion, but memory, a piece of someone's story, hanging close to the heart. As he approached the gate for first class, a flight attendant stood poised, clipboard in hand, uniform crisp, posture sharp. Her eyes flicked from his boarding pass to his face, then back again. There was a flash of hesitation, not because the ticket wasn't valid, but because the man in front of her didn't fit the mold. His clothes were too quiet, his presence too unbothered. She let him pass, but her eyes lingered. He entered the cabin and found his seat effortlessly, placing his bag in the overhead with the grace of someone who'd done this too many times to count. The silver cross had shifted with the movement, now resting fully over his chest. The overhead lights caught it for a moment, just enough to reflect into the eyes of the same attendant now walking past the aisle. She froze. Something about the necklace pulled at her. Not for its beauty, but its boldness. In a cabin filled with business suits and champagne flutes, it didn't belong, not in her eyes. She had spent years ensuring every detail of the first-class cabin radiated refinement and neutrality. No politics, no religion, no distractions, clean, controlled, comfortable. And yet, there it was, hanging quietly from a man who said nothing, demanded nothing, and had broken no rules, except for the ones she hadn't said out loud. She returned to her station, but her gaze kept drifting back to the man in seat 3A. He wasn't reading. He wasn't watching a screen. He simply sat with his hands resting gently on the armrests, his eyes closed, his breathing calm. The silver cross lay still, reflecting nothing now but presence. It didn't try to convert or challenge. It simply was. That somehow disturbed her more than if it had. She stepped forward. With trained professionalism, she leaned slightly toward him and lowered her voice to the standard tone of polite authority. Her words, wrapped in protocol, asked that he consider adjusting the necklace, tucking it in perhaps, for the comfort of other passengers. Not a command, just a suggestion. A request made many times before in many subtle ways, for logos, slogans, pins, things that made others shift in their seats. She delivered it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But he didn't move. He listened, then answered, calm and unwavering. He had heard this before, maybe not in these words, maybe not on a plane, but in boardrooms, green rooms, interviews. It was always the same message, just dressed differently. The discomfort wasn't in the object, it was in the eyes that looked at it. And this time he didn't intend to hide. The attendant blinked. She hadn't expected resistance. Most people nodded, adjusted, apologized for existing too loudly. But he didn't flinch. His voice, steady as a prayer, refused politely. He didn't need to raise it. He simply stated, this necklace wasn't jewelry. It was a part of him, a part he didn't remove to make others feel more comfortable. Her smile stiffened. She tried again, leaning heavier on vague mentions of policy and atmosphere. How important it was to maintain a neutral space in premium cabins, that some guests might feel alienated by overt symbolism. She gestured toward the cross with a hand that didn't want to touch it, as if it might sting. Again, he didn't move. Her breath shortened. She straightened her back, preparing to push further, but something in his eyes made her hesitate. Not defiance, not aggression, just truth. A quiet refusal to shrink. And now, others were noticing. Across the aisle, a businessman lowered his newspaper. A woman a few rows ahead turned her head slightly, pretending to look elsewhere. Energy was shifting in the air. Nothing spoken, nothing loud, but real. The kind of shift people feel in their chest before they understand why. The attendant stepped back, swallowed her discomfort, and returned to the galley. But her hands trembled slightly now, not because of his words, but because of her own. She had faced thousands of passengers, celebrities, diplomats, CEOs, but none had unsettled her like this. A man doing nothing but sitting quietly with a cross over his shirt. What was it about that? Why did it feel like a challenge? Why, in a cabin full of luxury and order, did one simple symbol feel so out of place? She didn't know yet, but she would soon. And the moment that answer arrived, it wouldn't come with volume or confrontation. It would come with a voice that didn't shake, and a memory she would never forget. As the captain's voice crackled through the intercom with the usual pre-flight greeting, the attendant turned one last time towards seat 3A, only to find a fellow passenger now whispering and pointing discreetly at the man with the necklace. Not because of what he wore, but because they finally recognized who he was, and her heart skipped, because she had no idea what she had just started. The hum of the cabin deepened as the plane ascended, slicing through layers of clouds that looked like waves frozen mid-motion. The lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm amber glow over the first-class cabin. Silence spread like fog, broken only by the clinking of silverware and the occasional soft rustle of blankets. But underneath that calm surface, something heavier lingered, something unsaid. In seat 3A, the man remained still. He hadn't removed the cross. He hadn't tucked it in. It lay exactly where it had before, resting above his heart, as if guarding it. The recognition had started quietly. A few whispers, a double take, a subtle glance from a passenger across the aisle. It wasn't the cross that caught their attention now. It was the man behind it. His name floated from seat to seat, unspoken but understood. Some were already certain. Others hesitated, unwilling to believe they were sharing a flight with someone whose face they had seen on screens for decades. But recognition spread like wildfire on dry brush. Carla felt it first in the shift of energy behind her, the murmurs, the way passengers straightened in their seats. Something had changed, and it wasn't just cabin pressure. She turned and followed the current of unspoken tension, and it led her straight back to him. And now she saw it too. Not just the necklace, not just the posture, but the familiarity. Liam Neeson. The realization landed in her chest like turbulence. And yet even now, knowing who he was, something within her resisted softening. That cross still bothered her. It wasn't the celebrity that unnerved her, it was that he had refused, that he had drawn a line. And now, in the quiet sanctuary of first class, where people paid for peace and predictability, he had created neither. She approached him again, this time more aware of the eyes following her. Her tone was more rehearsed now, like a script written in training manuals. She asked again, with a professional edge, that he consider concealing the necklace, for the comfort of others. Not because of any rule, she reminded him, but because of atmosphere. Some passengers had expressed concern, she said. Not many, just enough. He looked at her, then at the cross. His fingers brushed it gently, not out of defiance, but memory, and when he responded, it wasn't with aggression, it was with clarity. He told her that the cross was not for others, it was for himself. That it had belonged to someone he'd lost, that it reminded him of strength, not division, and that no one, not on land or in the sky, had ever asked him to hide it before. Her face didn't move, but inside, something did. Passengers nearby began to take notice, not just of the exchange, but of its weight. A phone angled upward from a lap. Another camera peeked out from behind a book. No one said a word, but the silence grew louder, the kind of silence that fills a courtroom before a verdict. Carla took a half step back, her smile thinning into something forced. Her authority, once unquestioned, now felt hollow. She returned to the galley with a tight breath and stiff shoulders. She hadn't lost control, yet, but it was slipping. Not because of what he'd said, but because of how little effort it took him to say it. Still, she wasn't done. She leaned into protocol now. Rules, chain of command. She tapped on the crew tablet, opened a file labeled Passenger Policy Enforcement, and typed in a few sterile phrases that made the situation sound more clinical than human. Then she turned to her younger colleague, Nicole, and gave her a look, sharp, urgent. Nicole hesitated. Even she had seen what was happening, and felt it. But she nodded and followed. They approached his row again, Carla in front, Nicole behind like a shadow. Carla straightened her shoulders, adjusted her scarf, and this time addressed him with full formality. Mr. Neeson. She informed him that failure to comply with crew requests during flight may require escalation to the captain, that safety and decorum were at stake, that visible symbols, even personal ones, could disrupt the emotional comfort of the cabin. And still, he didn't move. He remained in his seat, his eyes calm but focused, like a man who had lived through more than discomfort, like a man who had faced grief itself and stood taller afterward. He said nothing about celebrity, nothing about rights, only that the cross stayed, and that some things are not meant to be hidden. Carla flushed. It was the way he said it, not with pride, but with weight. And in that moment she realized she was no longer just arguing about a necklace. She was confronting something in herself, something she hadn't named before. Passengers continued to watch, not openly, but fully. The mood in the cabin had shifted from casual curiosity to quiet judgment, and not toward Liam, toward her. She had a decision to make, double down or surrender. She chose control. Carla turned sharply and tapped the comm. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Morales stepped out, mid-50s, seasoned, with a presence that carried calm and command in equal measure. He didn't speak right away. He observed, then approached the row, standing before the man everyone now recognized and the woman everyone now watched. He asked her for details. She gave them. He asked the younger attendant for a second opinion. Nicole's voice was soft, uncertain. She admitted Liam had been calm, respectful and clear. No disruption, no aggression, just conviction. Then the captain turned to Liam. He asked him to speak, and for the first time, Liam told the truth. Not the kind for cameras, not the kind for screens. He spoke of love, of a woman now gone who had given him the cross in a hospital room filled with machines and prayers. He spoke of the pain that followed, of how, in his darkest hours, when the world turned hollow, the weight of that cross kept him grounded. He said it wasn't about belief or display. It was about survival. and that to ask him to hide it was to ask him to forget the only thing that kept him breathing on the days when breath felt impossible. There were no phones lifted now, no eyes darting, only silence. Because pain that pure doesn't need to shout to be heard. And just when it seemed the moment would settle, just when Carla looked away for the first time, just when Nicole lowered her gaze, the captain cleared his throat, turned to Carla, and said 5 quiet words that shattered the stillness. "We need to talk, privately." And in that instant, Carla knew. The real turbulence hadn't even begun. The door to the galley closed softly behind them. For a moment, the hush of the first-class cabin deepened, as if the air itself were waiting. Captain Morales stood beside Carla, his arms crossed loosely, the weight of responsibility etched into the lines of his face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply asked her to explain, again, why she had escalated the situation. She spoke quickly at first, cloaked in phrases like uniform standards and passenger comfort. She mentioned complaints, environment, neutrality. But with each word, her voice thinned. Because somewhere inside, she already knew. It hadn't been about policy. It had been about discomfort, hers. The captain listened without interruption. Then he looked at her, not with anger, but with something heavier, disappointment. And she felt it. Because for the first time, the mask she wore, the perfectly trained professional, the composed figure of order, was slipping. And beneath it, she didn't see strength. She saw fear. Fear of difference. Fear of losing control. Fear of being questioned in the very space she ruled. Morales didn't reprimand her. He didn't need to. He just said that sometimes leadership means knowing when you've gone too far. Then he stepped out, leaving her alone with the silence she had created. Back in the cabin, the energy had changed. Liam Neeson remained in seat 3A, unmoved. The cross still lay where it had from the start, unhidden. Its silver surface caught the light each time the plane shifted slightly, like a steady reminder of all that had passed in so little time. Passengers weren't whispering anymore. They were watching, but not with judgment, with a kind of reverence, not just for the man, but for the moment. Carla returned moments later. Her steps, once sharp, were slower now, not dragging, measured. The uniform still fit the same, but it felt heavier. As she walked past each row, she could feel the stares, not aggressive, but honest. A mirror reflecting back what she had tried not to see in herself. And when she stopped beside Liam's seat, he looked up at her, calm as ever. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. So instead, she let her body speak. She knelt. The cabin froze. A ripple passed through the aisle as passengers leaned slightly forward, unsure if they were witnessing apology or breakdown. Carla's eyes filled with tears, not loud ones, not for attention, the kind that fall when pride can no longer hold the truth back. She whispered, not to him, but to herself, that she had been wrong, that she thought she was protecting peace, when in truth she had been shielding her own discomfort. That neutrality, the kind she clung to, was just a softer word for silence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he stood and reached out his hand, not as a gesture of power, but of grace. He helped her up gently, and for a moment, nothing moved. The tension didn't dissolve. It transformed. In that stillness, she looked at him, not as a passenger or a celebrity, or a man refusing to follow instruction. She saw a husband, a man who had loved and lost, a man who wore grief around his neck, not to provoke, but to remember. She breathed deeply, the kind of breath that only comes after a long time holding it in. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a second necklace. The same cross, smaller, a twin in spirit. He placed it softly in her hand. Said nothing. Just closed her fingers over it and looked into her eyes with a quiet certainty. Not everyone gets a second chance to carry something real. Later, long after the flight landed, long after the passengers filed out and the lights dimmed and the cabin was cleaned for the next journey, Carla stood alone near the jet bridge. She held the cross tightly in her palm, as if letting go meant forgetting everything she had learned, but she wouldn't forget. 2 weeks passed. The internet did what the internet does. Someone had filmed the moment in the cabin, the kneeling, the silence, the tension before the transformation. The video went viral. There were headlines, reactions, commentary, but none of that mattered to Carla, because something deeper had changed, and it wasn't for views or headlines. In a modest apartment miles away from the sky, Carla sat before her phone. No makeup, no uniform, just a quiet space and a voice ready to say what it should have said long ago. She held the silver cross in her fingers, not as a symbol of faith, but of truth, and she began to speak. She said she had built her life behind protocol, that she thought professionalism meant never being moved, that following rules meant protecting others, but in truth, it had been about protecting herself. She had been afraid to feel, afraid to be wrong, but that flight, that man, changed everything. She paused, looked down at the necklace and smiled, not out of pride, but humility. That cross reminded her what it means to listen, to see beyond titles and uniforms, to recognize the weight people carry, even when they don't speak of it. She ended the recording softly. "Thank you, Liam." And for the first time in years, she felt light, not because she had undone her mistake, but because she had faced it. As she placed the cross gently around her own neck, the screen of her phone lit up with a new message from a name she didn't expect. It read, "Next time you fly, let me know. I'd like to talk. Signed, Liam." If this story moved you, if it reminded you that grace can come from the quietest places, then don't just leave, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories that reveal the power of empathy, faith, and redemption, especially when no one's watching. And remember, sometimes the smallest symbol can carry the heaviest truth.